All right, so what I'm going to show you is a basic woodworking repair. What we've got here is a dent in this piece of furniture. Now what's interesting about dents with regards to wood is the following. Animal cells, they hold their structure by virtue of the moisture content in that cell, and when we take the moisture out, for example, when you preserve meat, and in the old days when they used to smoke meat or preserve it with salt, all they're doing is extracting the moisture out of those cells, and of course they shrink, so the piece of meat shrinks, which is why beef jerky and dried fish and seafood and things like that, when preserved, tend to be smaller than the original piece of meat. And the same holds true for plant cells. They've got moisture in them, but when that plant dies, for example, in this case wood, the moisture leaves the cell, but the cell doesn't change its size or shape because of the rigidity of the cell wall. And so that's one of the things that's unique about plant cells. But what happens when you get a dent like this, the cells themselves are crushed. And since they are rigid in nature, they're not going to spring back. It's not like foam and anything of that nature that would spring back into shape. So it remains in that crushed form, if you will. And so a basic repair to something like this involves a process to get those cells to expand back out to as close as possible their original size. And if they do all of that collectively, then hopefully this dent will come out. And so there's a great old school technique, and we've moved a lot over the years, and we've had folks come over and do repairs, and it's interesting that as fancy as equipment that a lot of these repairmen have, they seem to revert back to the very basics, and that is a wet washcloth and a hot iron. And so that's what we're going to do here to fix this dent. And so the idea is that we're going to inject moisture into these crushed cells as much as possible and get them to spring back to the form that they held prior to being damaged. And this was damaged in the last move, and so now it's time to get it fixed. So we're going to hit pause on this. I'm going to set it up because it takes a couple hands to do this, and I'll be back. All right, back, and here you can see the dent. I've zoomed in a little bit. I got the camera clamped to the piece of woodwork, and what I have, it's not going to be easy to see, but I've got a dampened corner of just a simple washcloth that I use for basically dusting and woodworking and things like that out in the garage. And it's clean, so we're not going to stain the furniture. And how much have I moistened it? Well, to the point where it's just shy of dripping, because it needs to be saturated enough that we can generate steam from the iron, and a lot of it, to get into the wood cells that were crushed. But at the same time, we don't want it dripping all over the furniture that's not damaged, because it could seep through the finish and into those dead cells and cause those cells to expand as well. And that's where you get water damage. A great example is when you have a cold glass of iced tea sitting on a piece of furniture, you forget to put a coaster, a couple hours later there's water there, we don't notice it, and guess what? You have a raised ring on that piece of furniture because those cells absorbed that moisture and they expanded, and now they're more expanded than the cells around, and that's what causes that ring. And so what I'm gonna do is grab that iron. I've got the washcloth. We're just going to put the moistened corner over that dent, and we're just going to steam it just like you would a pair of pants or a shirt or anything like that. Now you could use the steam function of the iron itself, but remember, it's going to shoot steam out of the whole length of the iron, and I don't want steam going all over the piece of furniture. I just want to concentrate just where this dent is. So I'm always looking underneath to make sure I'm there. And you'll hear it, like breakfast eggs cooking. So as this part of the iron cools off, you can hear that it's not producing as much steam, so I'll reposition it. And again, I check to make sure that I'm on the damaged area, making sure I'm not making contact with the wood itself. And it won't take, you won't be able to fix this with just one simple iteration on most dents. It's going to take a number of them. In fact, I've done 3 before I even started filming this, and you can still see it. There's a pretty good dent there. And as the iron cools off, I had to unplug this because there's not a plug nearby here. So as the iron cools, you'll hear less and less steam being produced, as well as you've got moisture leaving the corner of this washcloth. So I'm going to set the iron down. You'll find that steam will collect on parts of the woodworking that's not damaged, so we need to wipe that off quickly with the dry portion of the washcloth. And then I just pat dry the damaged area because I don't want water just sitting there. I wanted the steam to go inside. And then we'll just rub across here, and it's getting a lot better. It's not where it needs to be yet, so we'll keep doing this. I won't film each iteration of this. I'll come back here in a little bit. But I can tell you from when I first started this is actually a pretty good improvement. And the goal is to get this raised as near the normal surface as possible. And typically what you're going to end up with, one of two things. You're not going to get it raised to be perfect. You'll raise it to be slightly above, and then what we'll do is sand it flush, and then just put just a real light coat of matching stain here. And we aren't going to stain just where the damaged area is, because the eye will pick that up. We're going to put our stain across the whole area, just ever so thinly, so as the eye cannot pick that up. That's one case. The other case is the damage is bad enough, the crush area has been crushed enough that you can apply all the steam you want and you're just not going to get it out flush. So in that case, we sand, not just here, but across the whole area, so that, because the eye can pick up on just even the smallest variations in any straight line. And so we're going to curve into the damaged area and then back out to the flush area, but we're going to do it over a greater length here so the eye can't pick that up. And then of course apply stain, and in this case a semi-gloss polyurethane, real light. So again, I'm not going to film every one of these iterations. We'll come back when we get this looking better. All right, folks, back with you. I went through about 5 iterations on this, and it is a big time marked improvement here. Now, the blow that caused this damage was not a straight on blow. It was more of a glancing blow, and so there was a layer of grain, if you will, that was raised on impact, which prior it was just barely perceptible, but you can definitely feel it now. And why is that? Well, because all the cells in this area we've expanded out using that steam technique, and the raised grain, layer of grain that you could barely feel, you can definitely feel now, because all their cells are expanded, and has made the overall ridge, if you will, much more perceptible to the touch here. Also, you can tell something that wasn't here before in the previous section of this video. You see how it looks rough here, and that's because some of the wood cells in this whole area absorbed moisture and expanded, and that's what's caused it to be a little bit rough. But that's okay, because remember, we're going to sand this whole thing down. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to sand here. I'm not done with the steam technique yet, but I'm going to sand just a little bit here to bring that ridge line down, because I don't want to keep expanding it, right? It doesn't make sense. So I'm going to sand that down, remove that wood, and it'll smooth this out some. Remember, I'm not just sanding where the damage is. I'm sanding across the whole area. Now, if this were a deep gouge, we'd probably start off with 80 grit and then work our way up in numbers to a finer grit. But this isn't really that bad. It's superficial, if you will. And so I'm going to just start off with 120 or 150. So I'll grab that real quick. All right, so back, got a sanding block with 120, and we're just going to sand along the grain here, just in general this area. And it'll make this whole area look ugly, but that's what's expected, right? When you do a little bit of sanding on something that's already got a finish on it. That's to be expected. It's like a broken nose. It looks bad, but it's going to get worse when we have to reset it. And that's part of the process of fixing that. Same thing here. So I can see some of that finish coming off. This area is definitely, I'm going to focus just on that ridge line that we talked about. You can see where that ridge line, where I'm on into raw wood there, you can see it's a little wider color. I'm through the finish that was on there prior, and now I'm into just bare wood. And it's focused, you see, it's only in that area right there and right there, these two spots. And that tells you exactly that those were the areas that were raised more than the surrounding area, which is why we're sanding. We want to bring those things down. And we know for the most part that we've brought those down flush with everything else, because we'll start to see them blend in with the area around them. I'll go a little circular here for a second, and then I'll go with the grain. And bring that area down to the touch. Still got a little bit more here. In fact, I'll probably go, I think this is 120 I'm going to go with. Maybe 150. All right, so I'm going to swap out my paper here to get that down a little quicker. All right, change the grain on this to bring this down a little bit quicker without as much, not necessarily work, but I don't want to sit here and grind on this for a long time, just trying to bring down one little raised area. Much better. Make sure we don't take any corners off. We want those corners here to be still nice and square, so we don't dare want to come over with our sanding block. Remember I talked about those white raised areas that we were getting bare wood. See how they're spreading out now? Because we are getting them down flush with the rest of the wood on this piece. You know, I'd planned on doing another few iterations of the steam on here, but I think I'm happy with it. There is no indentation in this whatsoever, and so now I'm going to take this and just blend it across a larger area. Remember we talked about an immediate change to this area only. The eye can pick that up big time. If you spread it out, it makes it much more difficult for the eye to perceive any change in reflectivity, because we're going to have to put some polyurethane on here, a change in tone or color, because we're going to have to stain this, and I don't know what stain they use. This piece is pretty old, but I can match it pretty close, but it ain't going to be exactly a match, so I'm going to have to blend it in, and we don't want, again, the eye to catch that. All right, I'm going to change paper. All right, got my 220 now, so I went from 150 to 220. That's going to block your view a little bit. I'll come at it from this angle. And again, I don't want to just grind this area, because I'll end up with an indentation in the piece again, right in that area, which is the whole reason, the whole thing that we're trying to avoid. Yes. You can still come down. Wife wants to come check it out. You won't be on film. That is really nice. I'm very happy with that. So you see how it's very white here compared to here. There's still some of the old stain here. In fact, let me do this. Let me grab this. I'm gonna clamp to this piece. So that's what we're looking at. So I'm down to bare wood here, but that's expected. These were the two raised areas we talked about. We've got those sanded flush, and the whole thing really feels good. Very smooth. In fact, I don't know that I'm going to sand it anymore, because obviously when we put our stain on here, a stain has moisture, right? And it's going to cause that grain, those cells to expand, so I'll have to sand it again. That's why it's always a good technique to sand between coats on stain, and whenever you apply your polyurethane or whatever kind of finish you're going to put. So I think I'm going to pause it right here. I may blend this in, just lighten this up a little bit, and maybe a little bit here. So again, I'm actually going to apply stain to this whole area and blend it in, so it won't be caught by the eye. All right, back again. So this is where the damage part, the damage occurred. And notice it's not in an inconspicuous area of this piece. I mean, it's right on the front where it faces people, you're here having dinner, you can stare up and go, wait, what happened there? And so you got to be careful about making things match and blending it in. So again, like we talked about, the eye can't see. So what I'm going to do is come to a part of this, it's a hutch basically, come to a part of this hutch where it's got the same finish, the same stain that was put on by the builders at the factory or wherever it was done. And I'm going to sand it down. I'm going to do it here on the top. Won't be seen. I'm going to sand it down much like that, where we have kind of a white area blending into less white. In other words, less previously applied stain removed. And then I'm going to use my own stain to put it on here and blend it in. So this is going to kind of be my area of experimentation, if you will, to blend it in, blend in the work. This is a finished part of the piece, but it's on top, and if it's not perfect, you'll never know. And I can't use this piece because the stain wasn't applied, nor does it have a finish the way the front does, and it's certainly not sanded. It's rough, and it makes sense because this isn't going to be seen by anybody. So that's what I'm going to do here, and I'll be back in a moment. All right, what I did was sand just a small area on top here where nobody will see. Not quite down to the bare wood, but bare enough that through the stain and the finish that was already on here that I can kind of test the stain that I have. What I'm going to use that I have on hand already that more closely matches what's on here is what's called Early American. So it's a light stain, but again, different woods have different densities and therefore will take stain differently. Also, the fact that there is and already was a finish on here may cause this to go on a little bit differently. My technique is just a paper towel, and I'm going to blend it in over a large area, so again, so the eye doesn't catch it. Still a light area there, so I'm going to focus on it and force the stain to get absorbed a little bit more, and then blend it in. It's actually looking pretty good. Again, I want to blend it in. And if we have to sand the whole front of this face to get that one little part to match, I mean, that's fine. As long as the whole piece is the same kind of color and tone, the eye won't catch that, even though it's slightly different than the rest of the piece itself. It'll already, even though if you have details on woodworking that are stained the same, sanded the same, with the same finish, they all look a little bit different because of shadows and the way the light strikes it, so the eye won't pick that up. This is actually looking pretty good. I'm going to let that dry and then put one more coat, if you will, to get it to absorb just a little bit more right here, but I think that looks pretty good. You can still see a little light color right here, so I'm going to let this dry and come back and put just one more light coat on it. So overall, I think the color turned out. The lighting in here is I got bright light coming through here. The lighting is going to distort the image just a little bit here in the video, but the blend and the color really worked out. I mean, you would not know that something happened there except for this here. And so this is where the actual indentation was, and there's still a slight indentation there, but you can barely feel. That's okay. We steamed it all I want to steam it, and I don't want to sand all the way into this thing and create a dip. But definitely, if stain does one thing for you, it will certainly show imperfections in the wood, and that's what that is. You can't even feel that though when you rub your hand across it. You don't feel these ridges here when you touch it, but they're obviously there. So I'm going to sand these out. It'll take this stain off. That's fine. I'm going to let it dry first. You don't want to sand stain that hasn't dried yet. And then we'll just apply another coat of stain on it. But I really like the way it blended in, and it really looks good. It's a little light here, but this is just the first coat, and it'll blend in real nice. So we'll let this stain dry and then come back. All right, sanded everything down until all of this was gone. Re-stained it. I'm not done staining, but you can see how this stuff still jumps out, and I'm not happy with it. So I'm going to have to sand this back down again. But here's what's happening. Inside of a tree, in fact, most every plant are these tubules called phylum. And the phylum is what brings the moisture, the water, and the nutrients from the root system up to the top of the plant, in this case a tree. And most wood is cut parallel to the phylum, parallel to the tubules, and we call that ripping. Sometimes it's cross-cut. We cut 90 degrees to the phylum, or grain. When you see grain in wood, that is the dried out tubules, the phylum. What has happened here, the phylum runs the length of this piece of wood, but where this thing was hit, and it was hit pretty hard. In fact, I noticed a little dent right here. I'll fix that later, and I won't bore you with the video on that. But the piece, whatever it was that hit this, struck it right here. So what happened is that phylum was severed and then upended so that it's actually pointing out of this wood towards us. And phylum are like little miniature soda straws. And so what has happened is, or what is happening, is that the stain is going down those tubes, and of course only little ways, maybe a tenth, a hundredth of a millimeter, I don't know. But when you have liquid going down tubes, it'll go down those tubes much deeper and thicker, if you will, than, or depth-wise, than if we just put it on the outside of these tubes. So I hope that makes sense. So in other words, this part of this piece is absorbing more stain because the ends of those tubules that were severed and then upended to point towards us are accepting stain, much more stain than the surrounding area. In fact, you can see the grain here. Those are the edges or the sides of the tubules of the phylum, and these are the ends of the phylum poking up at us. It's a out of focus shot, I recognize, but anyway, that's what's happening. I zoom in a little bit more. And so what I'm going to do now, I'm going to sand it back down to get rid of this dark stain, and I'm going to put a super light coat of, believe it or not, satin polyurethane just on this area here, because you can actually put stain on top of polyurethane to darken it in, and I'll blend it all in here. But what that will do is it'll seal these tubules, or at least cover them with a clear coat, so to prevent the stain from going down into the ends of the phylum. So I'm going to go back to sanding this, and I'll come back to you and show you how it went. I resanded it. Let me turn some lights in here. Let's see if that helps. There we go, much better. So I resanded it again to get kind of some of those imperfections out. There's still a slight little dark area. See where that spot is? But there are a number of those here, and this spot will not stand out any more than the other. So I'm applying just a little bit of stain at a time, working from the outside. I'm sorry, that's my wife yelling at the dogs. Working from the outside in to blend it in, and I'm watching what I'm doing and not really looking into the camera because I don't want to mess this up. So if I don't catch it in the field of view, yeah, there's something to be said about having sandpaper and all that on a nice table, but I'm still very cautious. What I was going to show you, I'm using very little stain. In fact, to the point where sometimes I will just clean off the inside of the lid a little bit and get some on my, yes, paper towel. I'm using a paper towel, a little unorthodox, but for small staining projects, I'll use either a shop towel or a paper towel or a washcloth, you know, something that doesn't have a lot of, you know, lint to it. And as long as the surface is sanded very well, nothing's going to get snagged and pulled off. And so far I like what I'm seeing. I come over here, and there's the iron we were using earlier. So I'm just going to do just a slight dip, on there. And I'll start in an area that already has some stain because I can blend that in easily to get a lot of the just initial moisture off the tip of the paper towel. And then I just work my way across to blend in, just doing small circles like so, and then I'll go linear. There's a little bit here, but that'll blend in just fine once this darkens up. It stands out because the rest of this is light, the surrounding is light, but when I bring it up to the same tone and level as over here, then this isn't going to stand out at all. It's taken stain a little bit more than the other areas because it was damaged, and we talked about those tubules, that phylum, which is why wood that's cross-cut, if you ever, cutting boards use that effect. They'll have, you know, cutting boards have usually a lot of times are made out of little square sections, and some of those square sections are turned up on end, in other words, grained in up. You're staring down into the phylum, and the other sections were cross-cut, so the phylums run parallel. The grain is running level with the horizon, if you will, as the board sits on the countertop. And then when it's stained, you'll notice the end grain that's pointing up at you will take that stain completely different. And of course it has a pretty cool effect that people like, and that's why you see that oftentimes on cutting boards. Chess boards will use that technique when people make chess boards. Yeah, so that'll blend in real nice. So I'm going to continue doing what I just showed you, but you can see already how that's working out. And of course we're looking at it from 6 inches away. If we come back over here, you can still see that light area. However, that will go away once we get the stain in there. And that dark area inside the light area, like we talked about right there in the middle, that'll go away too. So I'm going to keep doing this and I'll come back to you. All right, back. Pretty much just sanded this down. I didn't use the polyurethane technique because I just sanded it down. It still stands out a little bit, but that's mainly because the surrounding areas are much lighter than that area itself. This is where the damage was at. So as soon as these surrounding areas darken, this will not contrast as much, because you can look over here and see how dark this is. Plus you can see there's other dark areas along here, which were left behind because that's part of the design, you know, to intentionally show grain and other details like that in the wood. And I changed the lighting a little bit, and you can actually from back here see that that area is still a little bit lighter than the surrounding areas, because I've got a couple light coats of stain on there. But again, coming over here, you can see that. And how I'm applying that stain, a little unorthodox, using a paper towel with just my fingertip. Now, there are some that would cringe at that because of fibers and things like that, but I don't use it much, just a little bit. And I've already got the lid on the stain, but I will actually sometimes just clean the inside of the lid off to get what I want on here. And I'm not attempting to stain this thing in one sitting, if you will. I'm just going to slightly work my way from outside in across the piece or the area that I want to stain, and I'll start from here, and it'll leave a border there, an edge. That's okay. I'll come across, and you can see a little bit of an edge there, but that is what I'm going to blend in over time. And I didn't put any stain on here, so I'll blend that edge in. You'll have a little bit of an edge right there, you can see, and I just do that over and over with just the littlest of stain. If I take my finger and actually dip it ever so slightly into the can, I'll actually come over here where I really don't need the stain, blend it in, and then I get a rag, if you will, end up with a rag that's not as saturated as it was when I first dipped it into the can, and that helps me control the flow of stain transferring from the rag or the paper towel to the wood. And I'll use paper towels, I'll use shop rags, actually quite often for just small areas like this. They're easy, they're cheap, and I don't have to worry about cleaning brushes and whatnot, so, or sponges or whatever it is you're using to apply stain. So I'm gonna let this sit and dry quite a bit, because if you don't let it fully dry, then the next coat of stain can actually remove the coat that's underneath it. So I want to let this adhere and dry, and then we'll come back for another round. I won't film that, I'll just bring it closer to the end product.